Great. So that was amazing. Let's go through some questions. So at this point, everybody, we're going to start the Q&A portion of the event. Feel free to submit any questions that you have for either the director, Craig, or our glaciologist, Maddie, into the chat. We already have a bunch of questions. So let's get started. Let's see. So we've got a question from Frank's Elementary. In the part of the documentary where we have the glacier waters that are melting and running down the mountain, why were the waters turning red?
It's a good question. So what happens is that the rocks and the ground area has been covered by these glaciers for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. And when the glaciers recede, when the ice melts and exposes these rocks, these heavy metals, to the air, they oxidize. And so particularly in these areas where you've got high concentrations of these heavy metals, the interaction with the atmosphere causes them to oxidize, they turn red, and a lot of that toxicity flows down those rivers. And it was unusual because it's not something you ever think about in terms of being a threat to people who live downstream from glaciers. When the ice melts, you think, well, maybe they'll get a bit more water. But this, in this case, it's actually toxic water. So that people can't drink the melting ice.
So Maddie, is this a thing that happens with all glaciers that are on top of mountains, or are there ways that we can sort of prevent the water that's melting from ending up being toxic for humans?
That's not something I actually too sure of the answer of. So I do know that there are plenty of mountain glaciers whose water is very clean to drink. And so I would assume that it's sort of a local issue. And that's sort of what it sounds like. So I'm not actually too sure too what we could do to kind of try and mitigate and make the water that is coming off of the glaciers cleaner, other than kind of processing it after it's already melted. But maybe Craig, you have more that you might wish to add to that.
Yes, you're right. It's not something that happens to all glaciers. And in fact, that was the only incident that we've seen of that. But that's why we thought it was critical to show it, because it's another side of melting glaciers that is threatening the local people right there. So they would have to treat that water, but unfortunately they don't have the infrastructure to do that in Juarez. And so it continues to be a threat, and it's getting worse in that particular location.
That's wild. Yeah, I'd never even thought about that before. You definitely think of glacier water as being this like pure source, right? And it's not for everybody. All right, our next question is from Megan. Craig, how long did it take you to film this movie?
It took us 4 years to film. We went to 12 locations around the world. And because we were working with the glaciologists in Grenoble that performing the Ice Memory Project, where they're taking those ice cores from glaciers to study the atmospheres going back 800,000 or a million years. Their recommendations were that we go to Antarctica and we film what's happening there, that we go to the Himalaya, which they call the third pole, because it has, outside of the poles, the polar regions themselves, the Arctic and Antarctica, it has the most ice. And also the European Alps, because that's where the ice loss is significant, where it's easier to film it and to see it and to illustrate the problem. And also particularly with Antarctica, because the Antarctic holds 70% of the world's fresh water. So when it does all melt, and there is significant ice sheets there, when you fly across the top of Antarctica, as we did with NASA, as you saw in the film, and you look down and you just see thousands of kilometers of ice, and in some places where those nanoks, those mountain peaks are coming up through the ice, below them, it goes 4 kilometers down, and you think, well, we seem to have plenty of ice. But as John Sontag from NASA said, ice that we recorded then, the data showed that ice was melting the size of the Titanic every 10 seconds. And NASA's since updated that. And today they're saying ice is melting the size of 2 Titanics every 10 seconds. And that has to go somewhere, and it goes into the oceans. And when you realize that that volume of frozen water is melting and going into the oceans, then you understand, as we showed in that graphic, the significance of the coastal regions as waters rise around the planet.
That's wild. Thank you for that. The next question is from an 8th grade classroom. How many locations of the ones that you filmed are currently being affected by disappearing glaciers?
So as I just said, we focused on those particular areas, but look, we could have gone to glaciers all over the world. Most of them are melting. In fact, there's only a couple of examples, and that's in Greenland, and maybe Maddie can talk to that a bit better, but where they are actually seeing glaciers that aren't melting. And there's one or two that I'm aware of. But generally all over the world, this problem is happening quickly. And as we said, there in Peru, they've lost half of their glaciers. Now, Peru has the greatest concentration of subtropical glaciers anywhere on the planet. And since the 90s, they've lost more than 300 of them. So it's not only happening, it's happening very quickly.
Yeah. Our next question is from Phoenix, Arizona. We've got an 8-year-old who wants to know, do some of the people in our government really not believe that climate change is happening, or do they just not believe that it's important? That's from Layla.
That is a very good question, and it depends on who you talk to. There are people in government who understand the science around climate change. But what is interesting is that most governments are reactive, and they react to pressure. And we have lobby groups all over the world who work with governments to get what they want from governments, and they're generally run by big business. And so what's happened, and we're certainly seeing this in Australia now, is where I'm from, is that the oil and gas industry has a lot of money, and they're very powerful, and they're able to influence the government. So in Australia, we have a government that refuses to accept the facts with the climate crisis. And so they're not mitigating, or they're not doing things to help stop the problem. They're not investing in renewable energy. They're not trying to stop the fires and the floods that we're now seeing. I came from Australia 3 weeks ago, and Australia, after the worst fires it's ever seen, is now having the worst floods they've ever seen. And these are events that scientists predicted a decade ago, and they told the Australian government that it was going to happen. Now, in America, what was interesting was when we started the film 5 years ago, it took a year to edit it in post-production, the general acceptance that climate is a problem and that science was factual and that humans were responsible. In surveys that were done, less than 40% of people in America understood the science or agreed that the science was factual. So they didn't believe in climate change. And that was, I think, had a lot to do with the government of the time, the administration that was running America at the time. Today, that figure has changed completely. It's now more than 90% actually agree with the science and understand that the science is factually correct and that humans are responsible for climate change. So we're seeing this big swing. And so back to that question, it does help to have a government that is science literate and that trusts the scientists that it's actually funding to go out and find this research, because the scientists are the expert. These people spend their entire lives measuring, understanding, collecting data, doing the research, and then compiling it. So we must accept the science and the scientists, because these are the people who actually understand what's really happening.
Like Maddie. Thanks for joining us today, Maddie. So Maddie, we've got a question for you. How did you first get interested, and what made you decide to study glaciers?
That's a really good question. So I think you guys probably saw toward the end of the documentary the picture of the coastlines retreating all across the world. And so I'm actually from a town in southern Louisiana, along the Gulf of Mexico, right by New Orleans. And so I actually started thinking that I was going to go into the petroleum industry, and then kind of started learning more and more and more about the impact that rising sea level would have on my community. And that's how I sort of decided that I wanted to study glaciers and try and figure out what we can do to try and mitigate the impacts that rising seas will have on these coastal communities.
For sure. So one question that a bunch of folks are having, like, I'd like both of you to answer this question and see where your answers overlap. What can we do to stop climate change as individuals, and like, what can we as individuals do to pressure our governments to prevent this from getting even worse? Maddie, you go first.
Thanks. So as an individual, there are things that you can do every single day to help. Things like turning off the light, trying to sort of minimize your travel. If there's a place, if you're going to the store and you can ride a bike or walk, do that. And then also tell people about what you've learned today and kind of what you learned, because that's how we get the word out, and that's how we make the biggest change, is by telling other people about it, because every person you tell, they're going to tell 10 more people. So I'd say definitely sort of spreading the word. And then something that I've kind of started to do is sending emails and calling your local representatives, just so that they know that their constituents care about this, and because it's their job to listen to us and to try and do what's in the best interest of the people that they're serving. So that would be my response.
And I'll add in there that when I contact my representatives, they don't ask how old I am. So just because you can't vote doesn't mean that you can't pressure your people who represent you. All right, Craig, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with both of you there, and particularly what Maddie said. Get people engaged in the issue. Take your families along to see The Last Glaciers at IMAX. It looks incredible, by the way, on the big screen. You see those beautiful shots of the mountains. And on the big screen, you actually start to empathize with the problem and with these dying glaciers, because it's just it puts you right in the mountains. So take people to see the film. Definitely, we need systemic change. So we have to change the way our governments look and act on issues like the climate. And that means we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. The problem we have is that we're pumping these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the Earth, if you look at space shots from NASA, has this tiny little atmosphere that goes around. It's very thin and very fragile. And so it's like, as we're putting these greenhouse gases, it's like standing in a glass jar and smoking, and someone putting the lid on. As the smoke continues, then it starts to pollute the atmosphere that we as humans and other species require to live on. So we have to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to move and transition to renewable energy. And we need to do that orderly so that we don't disrupt the economy too much, but we need to do it immediately, because the later we lead the transition from the fossil fuels to create energy to renewable sources of energy, then the more difficult it becomes, and the more disorderly that transition becomes, and the more difficult it then becomes for governments around the world to actually make that transition happen. And as we show in the film, people are already being affected by the problem. And that means people are migrating because they have to go to where they can find water. They have to go to where they can find power sources where the hydro schemes have dried up. And that is creating problems already. So as the UN representative in the film says, we have about 10 years to make sure that we do this properly.
All right. I think that's a pretty good note for us to end on. Thank you so much for taking time today. One thing I want to mention, there were a couple of questions about like, how can we take the carbon dioxide that's in the air and do something about it? We actually had a session on carbon recapture that you can go to youtube.com/Skype-a-Scientist and watch our scientist, Chen Zhang, talk all about carbon recapture and kind of the realities of that technology, both in the hopeful direction and the downsides direction. It was really interesting. So you can check that out. Definitely check out the movie. Is it also going to be it's on Netflix as well, right?
No, not at the moment. It's on IMAX exclusively. So
sorry about that.
So check, we've got a web page, thelastglaciers.com, which has all the science in there. It's also got where the cinemas, as the cinemas are opening up to the film, or you can go to IMAX.com and it will tell you where all the screenings are.
Awesome. So yeah, take your families to go see the movie again. If you loved it, we hope you did. We sure did. Thank you, Craig, for taking the time to be with us. Maddie, thank you for sharing your expertise. Everybody, we will be back here next week talking about more science. You can always check out what we're doing at skypeascientist.com. Kay, thank you for interpreting. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.